Yes.
Okay. And you can still see this.
Okay, just give it 1 second. Sometimes there's a little bit of a lag, and I'm gonna spotlight you, and I think you're good to go. Take it away.
Cool. So my talk is called A Crash Course in Terraform for Python Deployment. I've had the opportunity to learn Terraform and some of the basics of cloud networking as part of my job. And I thought it was about time to start to talk about it and write some blog posts. So this is sort of a first draft. So what is Terraform? Terraform is an open source infrastructure as code software tool that provides a consistent CLI workflow to manage hundreds of cloud services. It's a way of specifying what kind of infrastructure you want without specifying the exact steps you need to take to get there. So it's very cool. And we'll be using it today to coordinate the deployment of a Flask app. So in order to follow along, all you need is Terraform and cloud provider. I like Google Cloud, so I would install the Google Cloud SDK and create a project. A project is just where resources live. And the goal is to run this bash script on a server somewhere and expose it to the internet. So what does this script do? It updates Linux, the apt package manager. It installs Python 3 and pip. It installs Flask. And then we're running the most minimal Flask application imaginable. It's an application that when you go to the root, it returns a JSON saying hello. And then you run that with Python 3 app.py. So that's the goal. How do you get there? Well, in Terraform, you create something called a specification, which specifies what resources you need. First, though, you need to establish a relationship with an infrastructure provider. So like I said before, we're going to use Google Cloud. This is just the boilerplate you need. You need the add-ons, which is the first block of code. And then you need to configure your authentication, as well as the project and the region. All projects in Google Cloud, and I think every cloud provider is tied to a region. That's just a technical implementation kind of detail. I created a project earlier called Hello Terraform, so I specified that here. And then we get into the meat of the Terraform specification, where we start to define what kind of resources we want. Here we have a resource of type Google Cloud, Google Compute Instance, which from the perspective of Terraform will be called Flask. And then from the perspective of Google Cloud will also be called Flask. So with that, we get to specify some of the details of what this instance will do. This is just the server. And we're using a very small kind of computer to provide this Flask app, E2 Micro. It costs like $7 a month to run. We specify the zone in which to launch that computer. And then we specify some of the details about the boot disk, in this case, the operating system. So we're going to run Debian 10. So that's the first part. And here's the cool part. You can specify a startup script. So that's where we add the script from earlier. Update the package manager, install Python, install Flask, and run Flask. This is just a bash script. You tell it to run. And as soon as it runs, it will run this script. So it's a very simple way of accomplishing this kind of deployment. And then finally, there's some details involved in configuring the firewall so that it's exposed to the internet. You had to specify a tag, which is how rules will know to allow that instance into that kind of grouping of firewall rules. And then you give it a network interface to give it a public IP address. So that's pretty simple. And that's all we need to do to specify the instance resource. There's one other thing we need to do, which is to create this firewall rule that I mentioned earlier. So here we have a resource called that is of type Google Compute Firewall, that from the perspective of Terraform is called default. And from the perspective of Google Cloud is called Flask App Firewall. It's just a name that shows up in like the Google Cloud console. Then you tell it to apply to the network called default. That's what we gave to the instance earlier. And you give it the target tag that we gave to the instance as well. And finally, you give it this rule. Using the TCP IP protocol, allow incoming traffic to port 5000, which happens to be the default port for Flask. That's it. You put all that in a file called main.terraform. You run terraform apply in that directory. And a few minutes later, your Flask app is running. I ran this a few minutes ago. And you can curl against the IP address that shows up in the Google Cloud Console and specify port 5000. It hits that message we had earlier. So that's my talk. Here's the full code for deploying a Python Flask app. And I think that was about 5 minutes. Lauren?
That was exactly 5 minutes. Yeah, great. Any questions for Jeremy? So walk me again through the use case for this. So this allows you to deploy Flask apps very quickly. Does that help you automate like a multiple Flask app kind of scenario at work, or?
Sure. Yeah. That's not exactly what I'm doing at work, but this is just a way of specifying these kind of cloud dependencies in code. So that you don't have to directly interface with like cloud APIs. You can specify what you want.
Oh, I see the use now.
Yeah.
All right, fantastic.
There's all kinds of cool things you could do with this. Like you could make it a GitOps kind of thing. It will like correct the difference between your desired state and the actual state. It's very cool.
Fantastic. Any other questions for Jeremy? Would you recommend Terraform?
100%. Yeah, it's made me a lot more productive on the cloud, and especially on like AWS. I find it's.
Can you also handle like can you handle the security groups through this?
So this is a security group.
Oh, okay.
All different. It's called that in AWS. In GCP, it's just called like a firewall rule.
Oh, okay. Do you know what it's called in Azure by chance?
No, I only know those two.
Oh, just those two. Yeah, it's kind of funny how there's different terminology between the three, but do you always want to lock things down?
I feel like AWS makes something up and then Google and Azure like choose the actual name of the concept as the name of their service.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
I'm just going to check the spreadsheet here. I think that's the last of our, oh, excuse my dog in the background. That's the last of our talks for the YouTube for tonight.